Before starting any of your processes, you need to ensure that you've undertaken hand decontamination through hand washing, and that you're wearing all the required personal protective equipment that is appropriate for the task you're about to undertake. These will be listed in your standard operating procedures and will include items like lab coats, gloves, goggles, and masks as needed. Once you've finished with the hand wash and put on your PPE, you'll need to prepare your work areas. This includes taking out any of the consumables that will need to be brought to room temperature, as well as cleaning down your workspace. You'll also need to do things like prepare disc pots that contain 10% bleach. Your workspace must be cleaned at the start and end of every day, as well as in between changes of procedure when you'll be working with different specimen types. The same process will also need to be undertaken if there are any spillages. For fluid spillages, you'll need to follow local guidelines, as there may be additional steps that you're required to undertake. Preparing and cleaning down of your workbench includes not just cleaning down the bench space itself, but any of the equipment you're likely to use, including racks and pipettes. This video is going to cover how to set up a secondary plate or a purity plate. For this process, make sure the agar plates you are going to be inoculating have come to room temperature. Also ensure that the plates to be used are labelled with the type of agar that they are and are within expiration date. Using a permanent marker, split your TSA plate for E. coli or blood agar plate for Streptococcus pneumoniae into 3 quadrants. The process of how these will be inoculated will be the same for both organisms. We're going to start with Streptococcus pneumoniae, which requires a blood agar plate. You will need to label each quadrant with the specimen identification, either manually or using a barcode if available. The plate will also need a 2' label to indicate it's a secondary plate. If several different colonial morphologies from the same specimen are being processed for purity, these will need to be identified on the plate and recorded in the lab book, i.e. colonial morphology 1, colonial morphology 2, etc. Then, using a 10 microliter disposable plastic loop or flamed metal loop, select a single colony of suspected or confirmed Streptococcus pneumoniae from the primary plate and streak it onto your label quadrant of the secondary plate in a similar way to streak 1 and then streak 4, the quadrant method used to set up your primary plate. If you have more than one colony morphology, then this is repeated and you will change your loop or flame between quadrant inoculations. Once all of your quadrants have been inoculated, these can then be placed in a 37-degree incubator with 5% CO2 for overnight incubation, 18 to 24 hours culture prior to reading. For E. coli, the process is the same, however you are only selecting the dark blue to violet colonies for follow-up, and these will have been gram-stained as gram-negative rods. Do not undertake this process for any other colonies on the coliform chromogenic agar. You will need to label each quadrant of the TSA agar that you are going to use to follow up E. coli with the specimen identification, either manually or using a barcode if available. The plate will also need a 2' label to indicate that it is a secondary plate. If several different colonial morphologies from the same specimen are being processed for purity, these will need to also be identified on the plate and recorded in your lab book, i.e. colonial morphology 1, colonial morphology 2, etc. Then using a 10 microliter disposable plastic loop or flamed metal loop, select a single colony of suspected E. coli from the primary plate and streak it onto your labelled quadrant of the secondary plate in a similar way to streak 1 and then streak 4 of the quadrant method used in your primary plate setup. If you have more than one colony morphology, then this is repeated and you'll need to change your loop or flame your metal loop between quadrant inoculations. This plate can now be incubated at 37 degrees for 18 to 24 hours in a standard incubator. Record all necessary information in your lab book, including the ID lab number, the date the secondary plate was streaked, the time into the incubator, and any relevant observations or incidents. You will then need to clean down your bench space appropriately.